born in Vietnam. He went to live in a monastery at an early age. But this is kind of the beginning of modernism coming to Vietnam. He was one of the first of 6 monks to ride a bicycle. So he always had this kind of progressive viewpoint. Vietnam, as we know, had French occupation and then the American. And when he was a monk, at one point, he looked at everybody in the monastery and he said, you know, we could stay in the monastery or we could go out and help the villagers, or we could do both.
Following the death of Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh, our friend Gary Gach returns to the Plutopia podcast. Gary recalls his introduction to Thich and outlines his impact upon Buddhism.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Plutopia podcast. Our guest today is our friend and fellow traveler Gary Gach, who is an author, translator, editor, teacher, and poet, and who's had a lifelong interest in Buddhism and meditation, and is joining us today to talk about Thich Nhat Hanh, who died on January 22nd, just a few days ago. Hanh was a Vietnamese Thiền Buddhist monk, a peace activist, a prolific author, poet, teacher, and he was the founder of the Plum Village Tradition. He's recognized as the main inspiration for engaged Buddhism. So we'll talk about some of those things today. And we will start. Gary will start us with some silence.
The inviter. I don't hit the bell. I don't strike the bell. I invite the voice of the bell to allow us to listen to the present moment and let go of the past, the future, anything else, and just being with the breath, enjoying our breathing with the sound of the bell, returning us to our true home, the here and now.
All right. So, Gary, how did you first connect with or develop an interest in Thich Nhat Hanh?
Ah, excellent question. To take one step back, when I was 8, I had a mystic vision of the interconnectedness of all things. When I was 10 or 11, I picked up at the corner cigar store from the paperback spinner The Way of Zen by Alan Watts. And on page 35, I saw that what I had experienced has a name in Buddhism. The Sanskrit name I won't bore you with, but it's called the dependent co-arising. If this is, then that is the interconnectedness of all things. And at that point, I said, I must be a Buddhist. I mean, this must be explaining me to me when I'm really at my peak. But in those days, there were more Buddhas behind glass cases than there were living teachers talking to people. So, I studied with Paul Reps a little, and Suzuki Roshi came to San Francisco, and I studied with him. Katagiri Roshi. And then I had heard that during the Rodney King incident and the beginning of the Gulf War, that this Vietnamese Buddhist monk had come to Berkeley. And I went, gee, I'm sorry I missed it. And then he came again. So I went the second time. And as I was walking there, I kind of noticed that I'm already there. I kind of noticed the people. There were, what I would later discover would be teachers, social workers, health workers, veterans, some artists, my kind of people, you know. And I felt kind of comfortable joining into a big crowd of such people in this big auditorium. And then after I found my seat, these monks and nuns, both European and Vietnamese, came onto the stage and took their places. And there was like 5 or 10 minutes of this, the monks and the nuns. And I kind of realized this isn't just about the guy on the stage that's going to come on. He's showing me his community. And I felt warmth. I felt these are the kind of people that I would feel more at home with than I'd had at the other places I'd been to. Just a personal kind of, I don't know what, connection. And he came on stage, everybody stood up. And I knew this is my teacher. Just, I did my research afterwards. I found out, the checklist. Is he this and does the group that? And um, but yeah, I kind of like when the student's ready, the teacher appears. And gosh, that was
So I assume this was after he had been forced to leave Vietnam, correct?
oh, so now we're into his history, which
Yeah.
let's see if I can encapsulate it. He was born in 1926. I studied poetry with Robert Creeley. I don't know if you know who he was, but
Mm-hmm.
Bob Creeley and Thich Nhat Hanh are the same age. There's a whole generation that you could kind of map out. And he was born in Vietnam. He went to live in a monastery at an early age. But this is kind of the beginning of modernism coming to Vietnam. He was one of the first of 6 monks to ride a bicycle. Um, so he always had this kind of progressive viewpoint. Vietnam, as we know, had French occupation and then the American. And when he was a monk, at one point, he looked at everybody in the monastery and he said, we could stay in the monastery or we could go out and help the villagers or we could do both. And that idea wasn't unique, it was already in the air that you didn't necessarily confine yourself to the monastery in order to do your practice. If there was events in the world, a tsunami, a flood, an earthquake, where you could practice putting bodies into body bags to meditate on impermanence and be of use. Hmm? So this idea of being engaged in yourself and being engaged in the world as non became a great portion of his activity. founding a college for Buddhists, a Buddhist university, this schools for youth, for young people, charitable, community service work. And meanwhile, he came to America in 1961 to study at Princeton and then Columbia because he was interested in interfaith. And he went back. And the second time he came to the United States, he met with various people, this time Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and their conversation is something we are still learning about, how he introduced Dr. King to this idea of interbeing, the interconnectedness of all things, that Dr. King would so eloquently phrase as um, we are all woven in an inextricable web of connection. Um, American war in Vietnam, which kind of turned King's awareness around to become a activist not only for African Americans and social justice in America, but for the American engagement in Vietnam. And when he tried to go back the second time, they wouldn't let him back. He was refused a visa. And one of the key points in this was that the North and the South both wanted him to side with one or the other. And he said, I can't, I'm a Buddhist, I don't take sides. Or more deeply, he said, if man is my enemy, then with whom am I going to live? So this idea of engaged Buddhism and interbeing also meant non-partisan politics. And in the middle of a civil war, the person, historically, ancient Greece, whatever, the person who won't take sides is outcast. And they literally were persecuting and killing some members of his order. So then, yeah, he is in exile in the West and founds what's called Plum Village. You go to plumvillage.org, key resource for knowing about him, his teachings, his current activities, as well as this week's ceremonies. Um, and if I could just go on on this thread for like two more sentences. Um, Dr. King and Thich Nhat Hanh, whenever they met, would and in Buddhism, the word for Sangha of people that practice together a path of harmony and joy. And over the course of the next decades, in addition to Plum Village, he's established monasteries in 10 cities, plus hundreds of communities of practice. The one in Austin meets on Sundays at, I think, 5 to 7. It's called uh, plumblossomsangha.org. Mm. And sub-organizations like Wake Up for kids 18 to 35, one for teachers, because if there's going to be mindfulness in the schools, there needs to be mindful teachers teaching it, teachers who are trained in mindfulness as a practice, not just as a tool. Um, There's one called Arise, Awakening Through Race, Intersectionality, and Social Equity. So, as of now, you can see that at some point he had decided, when he was in exile, that rather than continue the Zen tradition of kind of doing one on one, which I'm typifying now as vertical, he went horizontal. He went wide. Um, and hence, we know, for example, about mindfulness through him. But I'm done answering your question. I could go on.
Well, and my understanding is that, I mean, what we have right now is within psychology, we have this sense of mindfulness as being an important therapeutic practice. And my understanding is that that all started with Thich Nhat Hanh, correct? That he brought it into the realm of psychology.
Well, when you said psychology, I had to do this mental adjustment, which I often, when I'm talking about East and West, because I'm aware that there's Western psychology and Eastern psychology.
Well, and when I use that word,
And you mean
I,
Western psychology.
I mean Western psychology. I know a guy who was a psychologist and who actually had a fairly major psychology website. And I was talking to him one time about mindfulness, and he said, "Oh, you're talking about the mindfulness movement in psychology." And I wasn't really before then aware that it was a movement within psychology. I was coming at it from
Yeah,
the
yeah,
Eastern side, and he was coming at it from the
yeah,
Western side.
yeah, yeah. Yeah. Well, it's not just Eastern and Western. So it's funny. The Unitarians have a press. It's called Beacon, and in 1974, they published a book that he wrote that was a manual of meditation, and the title was "The Miracle of Awakening." And Beacon said, because if you're an author, you never get the title, right? They get to change the title. They said, could we change it to The Miracle of Mindfulness? Okay, sounds better. Miracle of Mindfulness was published. And without going into the whole story of how this came about, um, largely through Dr. Jon Kabat-Zinn, um, the word mindfulness became a semantic umbrella for taking a portion of these teachings and not calling it Buddhism, rebranding it as just mindfulness, as a stress-based, stress try randomized with you know quantifiable results in healing and transformation and good things. And it started in the health field in a hospital in Boston clinic, and through the health movement, and psychologist, and then education, and now largely in business. And as that has progressed, it's come under fire by various. I could name you 5 books, but the title of one kind of says they're polemic, which is Mindfulness, the New Capitalist Spirituality. And I think, in all fairness, if you take a plant and you uproot it and you pot it, you've denatured it from the soil, the environment, the context from which it comes, which is not to say that the flower cannot be beneficial. But when you conceive of it as a tool or a technique rather than a way or path, a path to the transformation of consciousness at the base, then you have this kind of divide where the psychology people don't really know about the origins of mindfulness in something longer, older, and also you get this sense of cultural erasure of the East, which is a common world. Boy, did I not want to, but here we are. So, anyway, good question. I hope
Gary, it seems like mindfulness has fallen victim to the Western world's way of taking great concepts and homogenizing it and dressing it up for popular consumption. And I noticed I was watching a guy last night who's on the popular app Calm, and he's become like the mindfulness 5 minute guru. You get 5 minutes a day of mindfulness training. And it seems like there's no way to avoid this happening to really great things. But, I like the idea of mindfulness, but the commercialization is a bit distasteful.
I was at a cafe with my dean where I teach, a Jesuit college where I teach Zen, and he showed me his Apple Watch, and nobody's ever done this before. And it's really hard because it's not just showing somebody your phone, you've really got to lean in to look at it. And he says, my mindfulness, I have a mindfulness app that's on my Apple Watch. You want to see it? I said, yeah. And he clicks on one thing and has the definition. And he clicks on another thing. It says, take a deep breath. And, mindfulness is not about taking a deep breath. That's pranayama yoga. The point is that being aware of your breathing right now, as you're listening to me talking, and being aware of your breathing while you're listening, and being aware that I'm breathing while I'm talking, and not trying to change it, just being aware of it and allowing that as a base for awareness is what mindfulness is at its true source.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that they do that. Apple sort of brings a lot of things into this concept of mindfulness. So if you meditate regularly and you use a meditation timer that feeds into their health app, then they count those as mindful minutes. And that may or may not be mindfulness. People meditate with different ideas about what they're doing when they meditate. And some forms of meditation are different from other forms of meditation. So I think the bottom line here is that the real positive is that mindfulness has become something that people have learned to use. A downside is that it has been divorced from its origins, but also that it has been, like so many of the words that we use in our culture, it has become a word that has so many meanings other than the meaning that it originally had,
Yeah.
But I don't blame Thich Nhat Hanh for that. I think that it was a real positive that that he brought the concept of mindfulness into wider use. And I do think there's people who understand, who do definitely understand what it means and what its context is.
For sure. To bring it back home to our topic tonight, the Plum Village community has an app. Don't ask me what it does because I don't use apps. I don't have a cell phone. And so their attitude is, we don't want to be like an island away from what's going on. So if you want to try this Plum Village app to see what it's like, what mindfulness is like from, the founders, you can try that. Which to me is an interesting, it's the dialectic, the thesis, antithesis, will there be a synthesis? Meanwhile, if you look if you look on the Plum Village website, they say this is mindfulness is not a tool; it's a way, and that's because in the last, or it comes out of the last retreat we had with Ty, and on one of the days he invited us to break out into groups and talk about mindfulness because it had become, since he started it in 1977, this other thing. And then when he was done, he called all the teachers to the podium, and all the teachers, you were there, and he looked at everybody in the eye, and he has this way of looking you in the eye that's like, this is the Dharma, this is truth. And he says, you are not to teach mindfulness as a tool, it is a way. So he became aware of what had happened, and the community is aware of it. And I'll give you one last example before we go on to the next thing. Um, let's see, is this backwards or forwards? Or I don't know if this is in reverse. Can't see it. I wrote a book called Pause, Breathe, Smile. And it took me 5 years. There, it's a little better. And it's an encapsulation of a practical guide to these essential teachings of mindfulness that includes consciousness of your actions and the wisdom tradition of the interconnectedness of all things, as well as the breathing exercises, as it were. And if anybody's interested in it, I would recommend that you check out Pause, Breathe, Smile on your Audible or whatever, because I got to transmit it as the narrator. So that's my two, and so I'm saying it because I guess it's a plug, but it's my 2 cents, rather than being polemic about it. Of just, yes, you can offer mindfulness. I could offer mindfulness. There's no polemic involved.
Well, mindfulness is, he said it was a way and not a tool. And from my perspective, I think of it as a practice. Do you think that he would have felt that was consistent with his thinking, that it's a practice?
Practice is this word with it that becomes so synonymous in Buddhism. You know, in California, if you say a practice, everybody knows what it is. Other times people say, what is this, a law practice? Is this a medical practice? What are you talking about? The practice is that in every moment, we're aware if our mind has wandered off and been pulled off to the future, or rehearsing something or reviewing the past, and if that happens, the practice is in the return. Is in, oh, yep, my mind, I'm becoming aware of it, and that my mind has a mind of its own. It's capable of great things and also of tripping me up. And I'm going to return to the present moment in the next breath. And that practice is something you do 24/7. And that's really one of the key things that when you say you practice the tradition of Thich Nhat Hanh, people go, oh, yeah, you're one of those people who do it all the time. And you say, yeah, when I'm washing my dishes, when I'm going from the car to the door, when I'm folding laundry, you can always um, be aware of what you're doing with your breathing and what you're doing and your mind as one.
I saw a good example yesterday. There was a documentary about Miles Davis that I was watching.
Oh,
And they talked about how Miles at one point told his band, he says, when you get out in front of the audience, I just want you to practice. And it worked.
yeah.
So, getting back to the subject.
But just to comment on that,
Oh, okay.
when you're dancing with your friend on the dance floor, you're not trying to get anywhere. You're just practicing dancing. It's just practice, and that's what jazz is.
And practice is kind of it's a word that has some fluidity to it, I
That's
guess.
wonderful.
Well, so we talked about engaged Buddhism, and you talked about how, well, actually, I think Nhat Hanh is sort of thought as the person who inspired this idea of engaged Buddhism, which is, I guess you could say it's a movement. But what it seems to me that it's very consistent with the Bodhisattva ideal, correct?
Yeah, when you say it's a movement, you can say engage spirituality, and then you have Cesar Chavez, Martin Luther King, his teacher Howard Thurman, Rigoberto Menchú, Dorothy Day, people who felt that their spirituality couldn't be confined to a church or a mosque or a temple, that their inner work and the outer work were one. And he coined the phrase, even though he didn't invent it. But then he became a figure for those people, Martin Luther King, and so forth, and for the generations after. Gandhi is another great example. Um, Bodhisattva, for those just tuning in, is a song by Beastie Boys. No, anyway, Bodhisattva is a Buddhist term for the choice that a person can make if one wants to practice and be a Buddha in your life, be awake and live fully for yourself and others, where and others becomes the key to the difference between, well, I want to get everything right myself. I want to get it down. I want to really, understand it first, and then I can, be a better husband and a better person at work and and so forth. And the Bodhisattva turn is no, don't wait. You are inextricably bound up with everybody else who is a Buddhist, a Buddha in training, whether they know it or not. We're all here to evolve, I think, and to kind of defer your sense of this being about you and dedicating yourself to the welfare of all beings is this phenomenal turn that you have in the East Asian formulation of Buddhism, and it by saying all beings, you've already wiped out your sense of self, because all beings is like the interconnection with not just all humans, but the minerals, the vegetables, the animals, as well as the two-leggeds, the people. And to
And
do
it's an
this,
infinite proposition, right? It's like
yeah,
when you say all beings, that means the project never really ends, right?
is life endless? Is
Well,
wisdom infinite?
the set of all beings, I think, is probably endless.
Right. So, yeah, this is definitely part of the Bodhisattva ideal. And in my kind of trying to grasp the enormity of this great whale of human spirituality called Thich Nhat Hanh, who is now no longer bound by a personality or a body, which is a condition making his teachings available to be realized in a wider, fuller level. As I'm just beginning, as I think we're all just beginning to reckon, we were talking about his early life, and you can see this bodhisattva ideal in his early life. And he becomes then a living Buddha to thousands of people, the second most popular, famous living Buddhist next to His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And at some point he knows this, and he no longer calls himself I, he calls himself Thich Nhat Hanh. He calls himself teacher. He says, don't listen to me. Listen to the teacher within you. And he embodies that. And the next phase is where he's going now. Now that he's left his body, he elevates into the light, and I don't know where we will see these realizations. But yeah, it's part of the. Another way of putting, by the way, the Bodhisattva ideal is it's the Buddhist work ethic. You know, there's the Protestant work ethic. The Buddhist ethic is you're on the Titanic and you're the one giving out life rafts, vests. And while, there's not enough life rafts, and so you're just handing out life vests and the ship is sinking, but you're buoyant while everything's going to hell in a handbasket.
It makes me
Sort
think
of
about the
that's
musicians
Buddhist
on,
work ethic.
on the Titanic, the band that was playing as the ship went down, supposedly.
Yeah, there's a William S. Burroughs story about that. Anywho,
Oh, and that song is by Steely Dan.
that's right.
Yeah, that's kind
We
of
have
an
a winner
interesting
here,
song.
folks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, what did he mean when he used the term interbeing?
So it came to me as a personal experience. And when he teaches it, he would very often, hold up a blank sheet of paper and he'd say, look at this piece of paper. If you look closely, you can see that it's an interbeing of elements. You can see the cloud in the weave of the paper. You can see the fiber of the tree, which is earth. You can see the water that is the cloud. You can see the sun that nourished the tree. You can see the wife of the trucker who made the sandwich for him when he took the logs to the mill to be made into paper. You can see the whole universe in a single instant, which is Zen, which is the essence of that practice. And he'd be dramatic after a couple of years, and then after he did this, he'd take a match and he'd set fire to the piece of paper. Um, it's a made up word to explain the Sanskrit Buddhist concept of dependent co-arising. If this is, then that is. If that is, then this is. If I have an apple, there's somebody in the world who doesn't have an apple. And it has applications on myriad levels. And this is to where we get engaged Buddhism, where if I'm eating the orange, I'm eating the tree, I'm eating the sun, I'm eating the soil, which means that if I'm practicing, my practice is always an action in the world and a world of which I am not separate.
One of the key texts within Buddhism that, if you become that interested in Buddhism, or if you become a Buddhist, you learn about this text. It's called the Heart Sutra. And I know Thich Nhat Hanh had some issues with the translations of the Heart Sutra and changed the translation. Can you speak to that a little bit about what his thinking was behind that change that he was making, the retranslation that he did?
No, I still don't understand it. It's so deep. This came about, this was his last real teaching, and he had his heart attack that left him paralyzed and mute since 2014. Um, for listeners tuning in, I apologize if this is something you already know about and want to know more. I think the book is called The Other Shore, or The Raft That Takes Us to the Other Shore. But I will say that if you're interested in the Heart Sutra to begin with, and it is kind of the most common Zen Sutra, the teaching of the Buddha, there's a book called The Sun in My Heart, where the poet and Buddhist Peter Levitt spent, I don't know, I think like a month with the talks that he was transcribing, some of the books, and he wove together early talks by Thich Nhat Hanh about the Heart Sutra. That said, he's translated. There's hundreds of translations. Kazuaki Tanahashi has an edition where he compares some major ones to show you, well, these are points of where people differ. Tai, who's this brilliant mind, just made it his own. And I think one of his, I do have a sense of a little of what's going on, but it's so profound. I'm just like an ant. I'm looking at the ocean. That, okay, for people who have absolutely no idea what Jon and Gary and Scoop have been talking about for the past 5 minutes, one of the key phrases in the Heart Sutra is, form is emptiness. Emptiness is form. Form is no different than emptiness. Emptiness is no different than form. Emptiness means not nothing. It means empty of any lasting, separate, permanent sense of selfhood, identity. It means you're just totally free. Empty of all categories. And the Heart Sutra says that that is no different than a slap of a hand, a cup, the dimple on a newborn baby's cheek, the rainbow. And that the rainbow, the slap, the dimple on the newborn baby's cheek, if we look deeply enough, is interconnected with all things and has no separate sense of self. So I'll just say, and then I'd like to move on because I know I'm so non-equipped to speak of this yet, that having, studied the Heart Sutra for 50 years, his sense of it was, where do you put the brackets of emptiness? And he is saying that even emptiness is empty itself. And he finds a way to express that throughout the translation. That's kind of the best I can do for now.
As I recall, one of the things he saw missing that he wanted to include was that there is no being and no non-being.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, the idea of something is eternal and the idea that something is non-existent, which are misconceptions about Buddhism, aren't in the Heart Sutra. I think what's key for me is that in his living legacy, where we consider him as a social justice activist, a poet, a pacifist, a Buddhist teacher, founder of mindfulness, that he was a remarkable scholar who's left us a legacy of 120 books commenting or retranslating the Buddhist teachings in often very remarkable ways. And at the heart of that is the Heart Sutra and the Diamond Sutra and the Lotus Sutra and so forth and so on.
Gary, you spoke earlier about engaged Buddhism, and immediately a vision in my head popped up that I remembered from when I was covering the Vietnamese War. The 7 Buddhist monks who set themselves aflame as a protest. Do you remember that?
I remember the one.
Thich Nhat Hanh.
Thich Nhat Hanh, who was a member of Thich Nhat Hanh's order.
Is
Yeah.
it what you would consider extremely engaged, or is this, how do you view this?
That's something else. I had a hard time with it for a long time. There was a monk who was on a train being taken to a prison, and as the news of this came down and was heard in the train, when he was at his destination, they let him go, and he realized that he was one of many people whose lives had been touched, changed by the self-immolation of Thich Nhat Hanh. It's curious. There was a press release that there would be an event at such and such an intersection. One journalist showed up. That journalist reported about a monk who sat down in his orange robes, and the car that he came out of, the back opened, and monks brought out gasoline cans, doused him. Somebody struck the match. And it's not a legend that what was remaining after everything burned was his heart, which still remained. He was about to die. He had cancer that was incurable. And there's a sense in Asia of what we call martyrdom that doesn't carry the same burden, I think, that it does with Christianity, the sense of martyrdom. His letter is available. Yeah. Does that help you a little understand it better?
Well, I understood it when it happened.
Yeah.
It brought Buddhism to the forefront. I'd heard the word, but I didn't understand what was going on. I was much younger. This was the early '60s, but it certainly impressed me with their devotion.
Yeah, definitely. Reverence. Yeah.
So was Thich Nhat Hanh aware that he was going to do this, or did he have thoughts about it? Or do you know?
It isn't talked about much, so I don't want to dwell on it over much because I know that what little I know about what Thich Nhat Hanh knew isn't something that was kind of anybody wanted to make public without it. You're talking to him. I'll tell you a funny thing. Uh, in the last decade of his life, if you wanted to interview Thich Nhat Hanh, he'd give you an interview if you'd come live with him for 5 days or live with the community for 5 days. Mm. And I think anything I would say about Quang Duc comes out of that sense of I wasn't there. I've heard that he was aware. I kind of only vaguely have a sense of what he thought. He didn't want to make it very public, so I'll respect that.
He was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, and the person who nominated him was Martin Luther King. And I think they didn't award a prize that year. So he didn't actually win the prize, but the nomination was public. Apparently, the Nobel Committee was not happy that they made the nomination public, or that it was public who had nominated him or whatever. Do you know much about that? I mean, I think he should have won the prize myself.
That's another one that I don't have a lot of comment on, except to say, personally, what I know of the Nobel Committee is it's unfathomable. You're waiting for the chimney and the smoke to come up and find out who's been elected, and you go, who? Henry Kissinger? you know, I, and on the other hand, marvelous people are we become aware of thanks to them. There are other similar acknowledgments in the world, such as being invited to the Vatican, which I think are just as significant and which came to pass.
Well, and in line with that, we've talked about interbeing, and I think you mentioned earlier this concept of interfaith.
Yeah.
He was, I guess you would say, an instigator of the idea of interfaith, that faiths should be interacting with each other. Is that not correct?
Well, I'm not a scholar of it, but I'll tell you, he studied comparative religion as it was so called. I don't know who coined the phrase interfaith, but when he wrote Living Buddha, Living Christ, the first of 3 books about Jesus and Buddha, the critics were all saying these kind of narrow-minded reasons why this could not be so. And everybody else like me who read the book was like, oh, finally! You could see that Jesus is a living teacher that either lives in your heart or never lived at all. That is, if he lived and you understand his life, you understand that as a teacher, his teachings are alive within you, or they are worth nothing. And to do that, I think, was just an enormous accomplishment. And then, I've been at the Deer Park Monastery when a Catholic order came and wanted to be there and present an award or a trophy or a scroll or flowers or whatever it was. The time that I saw this, the liaison was a monk who had been a Gregorian monk and was now a Buddhist monk at the Buddhist monastery in Deer Park. And when he would do the morning chant, which takes about 20 minutes, and it's in Vietnamese, you can do the English translation, he did it in Gregorian tones and would make his own versions of the words that were very Catholic. He's led retreats with Palestinians and Israelis so that Jews and Muslims could see that they are not other than Semite brothers, worshiping the same Elohim or Allah, different words for the same one God. But I'll tell you, what really strikes me about interfaith and Thich Nhat Hanh is how he included earth spirituality, which you might call indigenous, you might call earth-based spirituality. He talked a lot about the ancestors more than any Buddhist teacher I'd ever heard. And toward the end of his life, he published a book. And thanks to Emergence magazine, you can read online, as of yesterday, 10 of his letters to Mother Earth. It's basically calling our Mother Earth a goddess, as the scientist Lovelock is saying is Gaia, but not from a scientific perspective, from a holy, reverent perspective that everything we see is a product of Mother Earth, ourselves included, and that we contain Mother Earth's minerals, soil, sunlight, water within us, so we're not separate from our mother. To me, I mean, nobody's really made a big case about that being, indigenous spirituality. And I think the book that I want to go to next to see how this is connecting in the dialogue is by Zenju Earthlyn Manuel, who has just published a book on Buddhism and indigenous spirituality. And she told me that she was considering joining the Thich Nhat Hanh order before she decided ultimately to stay with the Zen order. So that sense of interfaith as really being inclusive in a way that kind of redefines what is faith, what is religion, I think is, for me, something that I think we're still just beginning to walk down that path.
How different is Thich Nhat Hanh's approach to Buddhism from the Zen approach?
Ah, let's see. So we have another 2 hours. Do we? No, it's a good question. It's an important question, and I can answer it in two ways. One, here's um, here's China, here or East Asia. Here's India. These two big continents. And you know, when India and China met over the Himalayas, it's the first time that there'd been any contact between East Asia and India, and it was over Buddhism. But meanwhile, so as East Asia has now acquired and adapted and is adopting Buddhism from India, at the vertex below those two, you have Southeast Asia. And in addition to being on the Silk Route, it's also on the spice route of the oceans, which was a far greater, we're learning, far greater uh, vehicle of communication. And so Vietnam received both the traditional teachings from India, which is called Theravada, original Buddhism. It's where you get insight meditation and mindfulness, Vipassana, Jack Kornfield, Insights Meditation, Søren Stalsberg, and East Asian, which is Zen, as well as Pure Land, the Bodhisattva ideal. And not always in Vietnam, but often in Vietnam, you get this blending of the two major streams of Theravada and Mahayana. And Thich Nhat Hanh's tradition very much marries the two. You study the four establishments of mindfulness, you study the full awareness of breathing, the two core texts by the Buddha about mindfulness. And you study the Heart Sutra, the core teaching of Zen. And so it isn't like you study them separately. You take a Zen approach to the Four Noble Truths and say, well, they're really two. They're suffering and non-suffering. And they're two interconnected, so they're both one, which is a much more radical approach than the traditional Theravada approaches. There's four, they're very distinct. And on the other hand, he's including into Zen, like if you sit Zen for 20 minutes, you will probably experience these four stages of foundations of awareness, the, the full awareness of breathing stages. And so there's Zen mindfulness and mindful Zen. Now, to be more specific, when we say Zen, it's a Japanese word. And Zen is the Japanese tradition originally in Asia, it's in India, jhana in India, and then China, Chan, and then in Korea is Son, gets transmitted to Japan, where they call it Zen, and of all heard it and liked it and got it, it permeated the society more than anywhere else. And so when we in the West hear about this form of Buddhism, we hear Zen. We don't hear Teen, which is the Vietnamese form. And I'll answer your question. I talk in a 32-beat set of 16 sentences. The concluding part is, he left Vietnam. He was ordained. He'd been a monk, and at his temple, they gave him transmission to be a teacher. And when they did that, they give you a poem, and his poem included a line that he would be the one to transmit Vietnamese Buddhism. Because they were, he'd always been to America and back. He was the guy who rode the bicycle. And so as the one to transmit Vietnamese Buddhism, that's really what he's done. that people get so much about Vietnamese Buddhism just from Thich Nhat Hanh's way of teaching, his manners, the little things that you get in, like, for example, that you can stop, study, observe, practice. That's a very Vietnamese set where you need something for your head. So you get a book or a sutra, heart sutra, but then you don't just study it, you observe it in your life. And now that I'm observing in my life, yeah, I'm not a separate entity and I'm interconnected with all beings. Now, how do I practice that? You have to put it in action. So SOP, study, observe, practice, something I learned from Thich Nhat Hanh, is very Vietnamese.
You were talking about
Yeah.
the meaning of practice within Thich Nhat Hanh's thinking.
Yeah, well, I was talking about Vietnamese traditions, such as study, observe, practice. And in that case, practice varies according to context. So the idea is that you need something to study from a book, say, because you need to go outside yourself. Then you observe it in your everyday life, including on the cushion. And then when you understand it that way in life, not just from a book, you apply it in action. And the action includes Zazen, but it also includes, maybe I should be this, maybe I should do this more when I'm at work, or I should when I'm, on the street, or when I'm with my significant other. And then that becomes the text of life that you're studying. So you study. So it's this kind of like the spiraling. You study from a book or a website or the Plutopia news broadcast, and you say, oh, that's interesting. I think I want to observe that for myself, because you have to make it personal. And then it has to be put into action, and then putting it in life, in action, becomes the new level for studying. To me, that's a wonderful, I call it a practice, that I've learned from Vietnamese culture. And I think I was saying before we got swallowed up by the vortex of the interweb traffic that he has a book, a novel about a Vietnamese king who became a Buddhist. He has another novel of a Vietnamese legend called The Novice, which I think is very appropriate to read now because it talks about how you go from human to a monk to a bodhisattva to there's these layers of levels of ascension, which he's now attained the highest level of. And a book of Vietnamese folk tales, which I adore, called the smell of earth or fragrant earth, and then one more Stone Boy, which are just his short stories, some of which are Vietnamese too.
Thanks so much, Gary, for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Did you want to do an ending bell?
Oh yeah.
This has been very informative. Oh, sorry.
How to complete our conversation.
Thank you so much, Gary.
It was really sweet of you to have me. I'm honored.
Oh, well, we'd love to visit again too
Oh,
in the near future. All right. We will see you.
Plutopians, take great care. I look forward to our next encounter.
You as well.
Excellent.
You can follow the Plutopia News Network at plutopia.io. On Facebook, go to @Plutopia News. On Twitter, it's @Plutopia. With John Lebkowski, I'm Scoop Sweeney. This is the Plutopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.